To choose doubt as a philosophy of life is akin to choosing immobility as a means of transportation. Jan Martel, Life of Pi. This is AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. I'm here with Ramya Amathan. Rams, I have zero doubt in the guest that we're bringing on today. Greg David is an absolute banger of a guest, buttery smooth voice, incredibly articulate, and interesting taste in books. Apparently he loves
butter or like truffle butter?
Rockstars. Whichever one is the smoothest. I'm not familiar with truffle butter, but whichever one is the smoothest.
Okay, me neither. Only thing I'm familiar with is peanut butter. Greg, do you have a peanut butter smoothie voice?
I don't know. I don't know. The pressure's on because Jacob made me sound like I'm really smart and articulate, and I'm blabbering right out of the gate. So great.
It's about setting up expectations.
Yeah.
Like putting my guests on edge.
False promises, stuff like that.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Pretty straightforward conversation today, though. We know that you're a huge fan of memoirs and biographies, autobiographies from musicians, mainly rock stars. You have a ton of them. I know that this is a really popular genre. Celebrity memoirs sell like crazy. Just look at the Matthew McConaughey memoir, Green Lights. It sold over 6 million copies. No joke. In the Britney Spears one, the one by Prince Harry, nuts. They just sell like crazy. And a lot of the ones that you're bringing us today also sold quite well. And there's a reason for that. And you're a huge fan. Why? What's the appeal here?
Well, we're going to touch on a few of these books, but it's all about my age and growing up. Was born in 1971, and so in the 80s was the time when I was listening to music. I happened to start listening to hair metal at the time. I remember that my first concert shirt was Def Leppard, and my friend's was Quiet Riot. So, and like Judas Priest, the very first album I ever bought was a live album by Ozzy Osbourne. It was a double album. I paid $11 for it
on vinyl.
Yeah, of course it was on vinyl, Jacob. But did I say I was born in 1971? Did you mishear? Yeah, that's all there was back in the day, my friend. And then 8-track came along. But yeah, I grew up listening to all of these bands. And so as they started to write books about, growing up and how some of these bands formed, I just, started to devour them. And, you mentioned some great authors off the top there that are musicians or actors. And I think we just like to learn more about them. Like it feels as if you're in the conversation with them. And if they do the audiobook version of their own book, like they're literally between your ears. So you're getting the story right from them. But that's the reason why I love them, is because I grew up listening to these bands. That's why I wanted to learn more about them.
Okay.
It's one thing to learn to get to know someone. It's another thing to have a picture of somebody in your head and then have it clarified.
Yep.
And that's what happens when you're reading these autobiographies from celebrities.
Yeah, absolutely. Not only do you have the picture of them in your head, but you also have the voice of them in their head, right? If if they're a singer-songwriter, then you know what their voice sounds like, or if they've done an interview. So yeah, I hear these voices in my head that are drowning out the other voices in my head when I'm reading these books or listening to them.
I think that calls for a lot of scrutiny as well. Like any celebrity, not necessarily just musicians and artists, but when celebrities write memoirs, we're thinking, okay, but who are you in this memoir versus the interviews versus who I know you, like how I know you on TV or as a concert goer. There's just so much to nitpick for the consistency of their voices and personas.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if a documentary's been made about them as well, right?
Yeah.
You look at the Tragically Hip as kind of an example. Most recently, there was a 3-part documentary on Prime Video about them, and I've literally learned, I think, everything that I need to know and wanted to know about the Tragically Hip. And that does happen with some of these books that I've read. It's turned out it was like, okay, well, this isn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. And maybe I didn't learn a lot about that person that I couldn't have already, picked up in a documentary or seen in a previous interview.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk book, guys. Books. What's the first one that you want to highlight for us, Greg?
Yeah, the first one, and the reason for this whole discussion is it's called Brothers, and it's written by Alex Van Halen. And Alex Van Halen is the older brother of the late Eddie Van Halen. They are the two of them formed the band Van Halen back in the late '70s, along with Michael Anthony and David Lee Roth. And for me, it's the book, the printed book, is only like 200 pages, and I wasn't really sure what it was going to be about. I just knew that I wanted to read it because when I followed Van Halen before they broke up, it was I it wasn't I was this I liked it when Sammy Hagar was the lead singer. I wasn't a huge David Lee Roth fan, and so this was I knew was going to cover the David Lee Roth years of how Van Halen formed, but it's also the story of, Alex and his brother Eddie, and their story, and the fact that they how their parents met during the Second World War, how these immigrant parents moved to Pasadena, California, and they were the only Filipino Dutch family living in Pasadena in the 50s and 60s. Alex never spoke as much in interviews as Eddie and David Lee Roth did, so I wanted to hear a little bit more from him. And it really is a memoir about his brother and how much he still misses Eddie Van Halen several years after his death. As Alex says, I'm the older brother. I was supposed to pass away first. You weren't supposed to die before me. And Eddie Van Halen died of cancer. And so this again, immigrant story, them growing up, not knowing English in Pasadena, being bullied, how Alex first began playing the guitar, and Eddie was the one that played the drums. And then Eddie tried out Alex's guitar and was a natural virtuoso. And Alex said, okay, you're going to play guitar and I'm going to play the drums.
Yeah, and Eddie became like one of the most celebrated guitarists of all time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's that brother relationship, and it's also the foundation of how Van Halen, the band, came to be, and them going through the trials and tribulations of being a touring band and playing in small clubs before they put out their first album. And so that's kind of where it stops, is when they make it big, and Alex covers some of the albums that they made during the David Lee Roth years, and then the book kind of ends there. So it doesn't go into the Sammy Hagar years or anything like that. I will say that, Eddie had his faults just like everybody else, and Alex isn't afraid to call his late brother out on a few of those things. It was a really interesting read and a really emotional read for me as well.
But does he call him out like a tell-all? Like, I know you guys are thinking about this or that, or does he do it like a brother? I'm curious about the sibling side.
Yeah, he does it like a brother. He talks about how Eddie was stubborn about things, and how, he would say that he wasn't smoking anymore when clearly he still was smoking. And so Alex chides him for the amount of cigarette smoking that he was doing. Eddie Van Halen married Valerie Bertinelli, who was on One Day at a Time and was a huge star in her own right when the two of them met. And so he talks about the relationship Alex talks about the relationship that he's had with Valerie and Eddie and Valerie's son Wolfgang, in nice terms. He's very nice to them. I think what he saves his most kind of derision for is David Lee Roth and David Lee Roth's ego. But it's getting back to what you asked me, Ramya. It's more about the sibling chiding the other sibling for bad habits and maybe some mistakes along the way. But hey, we're all flawed.
Do you need to be a fan of Van Halen to enjoy this book?
That's a great question, Jacob. I would say that my short answer is yes. I think if you are a fan of the band, this is probably a must read. Yeah. But I also think that, would I pass this along to somebody in my family that aren't fans? Probably not. This is probably for the fan. I mean, if you pick it up casually, and want to check it out, I think that you'll get something out of it. But I also think that it'll lead you to Wikipedia to look up the band and find out who they are, because he kind of the book is all about, listen, you already know about Van Halen, but here's some stuff about my brother you might not have known.
Okay.
Another book that you read that I'm really curious about is The Dirt, which you describe as the pseudo-biography of Motley Crue. What do you mean by pseudo-biography?
Yeah, so each of the band members, Nikki, Sixx, Vince Neil, Mick Mars, and Tommy Lee, all provide their parts of the story to The Dirt, and it's kind of broken up into 4 parts where each band member is talking about how, what they were doing, how they grew up, and how they got into music before the Motley Crue was formed.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So you get everybody's perspective.
Yeah, it is. Oh. It's everybody's perspective, but they're telling the story to Neil Strauss, who is he's an author, and before in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, he was also a photographer, I believe. So the stories are being told to him, and then he's taking those stories and putting them into the book. It's really an entertaining book. I don't think that you need to be a fan of Motley Crue to read it. Because at the time in the 80s and even into the 90s, they were one of the biggest bands in the world. And so that was one of my favorite reads over the past, I forget when the book came out, but it's been one of my favorite reads. It was made into a Netflix movie, which is really actually well done. If you want to check that out, it's just called The Dirt and it's on Netflix. But yeah, a really cool book. Some of the band members, Tommy Lee, Vince Neil, and Nikki Sixx are very outspoken. So I was most interested in learning more about Mick Mars. Spoiler alert, that's not his real name. He was the oldest member of the band. He's still alive, but he's no longer in the band. He was the oldest member of the band. He'd been through a bunch of musical groups that failed, and Motley Crue was kind of like his last gasp. He'd been in country bands and everything, and so his story was the most fascinating to me because I just didn't know much about him. He was kind of this mysterious figure that would stand on the right hand side of the stage right, and just play the guitar. And turns out that he's probably the most gifted out of all those guys in the band.
When you, because obviously you're fans of certain people in the bands, and then there's not enough information about others, so you go digging. But do you also just pick up something because it's popular? You know what I mean? Like, how often do you do one or the other, where you're searching for more on the band through either documentaries or TV or books or memoirs and biographies versus just being like, this is getting so big, even if I didn't follow this person, I want to read it?
Yeah, that's a good question. To this point, I haven't really gotten any books where I wasn't interested in the band. Unlike fiction, where I'll kind of grab something depending on what's kind of highly rated and being recommended by others. But when it comes to the biographies, it tends to be something that I'm most interested in rather than kind of falling into it. One that is on my wish list that I haven't ordered yet is the autobiography by Tom Selleck, which just came out in the last year, and I'm going to pick that one up because I watched him on Magnum PI, and I, watched him in the Three Men and a Baby movies. So there's that interest to me to learn more about him. So yeah, it isn't really. It's always calculated. If I'm going to spend my money on a biography or an autobiography, I'm interested in them before I'll do it.
So, celebrities that are interesting, big personalities, have lived crazy lives, make the best autobiographies, in my opinion. Gene Simmons was the head man of Kiss, which is the weirdest band in the world, and I never understood it. He has an autobiography as well called Kiss and Makeup. You read that one. What did you think of it?
Yeah, so let's go back to the comment that you made about the band. So or about Gene Simmons and the band. So I'm interested. What is it that is kind of like for you?
The makeup. What the hell is up with that? It's so tacky. I don't know. Like just the whole presentation of it.
Okay,
like
gotcha.
I don't know. Maybe it's just before my time. I don't know. I've never seen anything quite like it before. It's like the Blue Man Group of rock.
Oh, I kind of love that. I kind of love what you just said, and I'm sorry that I stepped all over it because I think that's notable to pull later.
Wait, do you have an autobiography of the Blue Man Group?
No, I don't.
Okay.
But I love that you're saying like they're like the Blue Man Group of rock.
Okay.
You know what? It's interesting about them is I think that when they were big, which was in the 70s, with the makeup and everything, and there was an album called Destroyer that it seemed like, that was the one that kind of catapulted them over the top. The makeup was a way of the stage antics because they weren't great musicians. And I don't think I'm surprising anybody by saying that. They weren't great musicians.
Yeah, their music sucks.
Yeah, but by having that look, well, we can fight about that after. That's a different podcast. No, I tend to agree. There are some really good songs, but there's a lot of really bad ones. But anyway, they were setting themselves apart and being a spectacle and attracting people by the kabuki makeup and the outlandish costumes that they were wearing, right?
Kabuki?
So you make up for the lack of, maybe the musicianship by what you're presenting on stage. But again, what's interesting about Gene Simmons is it's an immigrant story. His mom came to America from Israel, didn't speak any English. He had to learn English, didn't know any English growing up, and was bullied in schools in New York City when he was growing up. And for a while there, he thought that he might be a rabbi. He went through started to go through those first steps before seeing the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Way. That's the exact opposite of a rock star.
Yeah. And so that's what was interesting to me to learn more about that, because you just all you would see about Gene Simmons is the public persona, the character. He did have a reality show with his family, where you saw a little bit more behind the curtain, but still, reading a book like that, reading his book, I learned a lot about this guy, and I'm like, yeah, he has a huge ego, yeah, he is a businessman, but he came from these humble beginnings, and dealt with a lot of crap when he was growing up, and now he's on top of the world with this band. So it was fascinating from that standpoint. And the same thing with Paul Stanley. He wrote a book, and talked about being bullied as a kid in New York City. He was born with a deformity in his right ear. Can't hear fully out of that ear. Always grew his hair long over top of that ear because he was super self-conscious about it. Met Gene Simmons, and they ended up making this band together. So it's fascinating to read about these guys, aside from the music and the makeup, just learning about them.
Did they still put enough about the music and the makeup, though? Like, I love getting the inside, obviously, with just the stuff you don't know, right? Like, that's what we're really looking for, the deeper, more human story in all of these celebrity things. But is there any more of the justification of why they chose to be who they are on stage?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's mentioned in both of Paul Stanley's and Gene Simmons' books, and it is literally, how do we set ourselves apart? Nobody's coming to our shows. What should we do? And they decided that, influenced by like David Bowie, the flamboyance of Freddie Mercury and
That makes
Queen,
sense.
and you just kind of amp all that up, right? Kiss, all four members created their personas. Paul Stanley was the Starman, Gene Simmons was the Demon, Ace Frehley was the Spaceman, the guitarist, and Peter Criss made his face up like a cat and called himself the Cat. So they created these personas, not unlike David Bowie with Ziggy Stardust, right? They just kind of amped it up to another level to set themselves apart from all the other bands that were out there. And you got to remember also in the 70s and the late 60s and early 70s, that was all about the glam bands in New York City. Everybody was dressing up that way, doing the glam thing like David Bowie and setting themselves apart.
Okay, so it is kind of a relic of its time.
Sure.
Dressing up extravagantly for these shows, right? Now the pop stars nowadays, they don't go out of their way to dress absolutely crazy. They dress maybe a little bit avant-garde, but it's not nearly as adventurous as David Bowie and Freddie Mercury and Kiss.
Well,
that's a different thing.
Yeah, except that, if you look at the success of Taylor Swift and her most recent tour, going through the different decades of her music, I don't know how many, costume changes that she would do. And also with and Pink with her doing gymnastics and high wire acts during her shows. So it is still out there, the bands do this stuff, especially when they're out performing live, right? You're getting the bums in the seats, paying that big money. You really want to put on a big show.
But this, I think, is a bit different. Like, it's one thing to have a big show, but it's another thing to, have a character.
Yeah, it's very different. But now it's like the character is just the person themselves, right?
Yeah.
When David Bowie performed Ziggy Stardust, he wasn't David Bowie. He was Ziggy Stardust, like a completely different person.
Yeah, and I think in this instance with Kiss in particular, they were marketing themselves. There were Kiss lunch boxes. There were the Kiss t-shirts. So they were kind of marketing themselves towards
their
kids.
merch.
Yeah, and young adults, and that's where they've made the most money is through their merch. And so they were kind of doing that at the same time, and that's why I liked them, because the merch was being available to be sold as well. So they were savvy businessmen. They may not have been able to play musicians all that great, but when they became big, they recognized we need to trademark our brand and sell our stuff, and they did.
Did they ever talk about this all making up for their lack of musical creativity, or is that just your opinion?
Oh, it's hinted in both of the books.
Really?
Yeah. I mean that it is hinted in the books that they weren't the best musicians in the very beginning. Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah, they did, but they wanted to get up on stage, make music, and in their cases, meet girls, because girls weren't coming to them when they weren't wearing makeup. That's for sure.
Okay. All right. What haven't we gotten to?
Well, one of the books is The Storyteller by Dave Grohl. And, I read, I listened to Andy Frank, manager of AMI Audio, come on and talk about the expanded version of that book. And I do, I read Dave Grohl's book. For those that don't know, he's the founder of the Foo Fighters, and he was in Nirvana before that. And I really enjoyed the book. Taylor Hawkins, who was the longtime drummer of the band, passed away. And I got this book around that same time, so it was a little bit harder to read, to read about the foundation of Foo Fighters and Taylor in the band, just because it was such a loss for the band. I'm also looking at the book now through different eyes because of Dave Grohl revealing that he, has a baby outside of his marriage. So there's a little bit of that, he's one of those guys, but again, flawed, right? So I really shouldn't, judge him on that because people make mistakes. It's just that he was always viewed as one of the good guys in rock because he would collaborate with people outside of his rock and roll genre. And he was, he looked like he was a lot of fun to be around. And to find out something like that is kind of sullied the book a little bit for me. I'm probably not going to go back and read it anytime soon. Because like Andy said at the time, there isn't anything kind of super revealing in the book. It's an interesting read, but it wasn't like, ooh, I didn't know that about Dave Grohl. Like, there's nothing like that's in this one.
Anything other books or celebrities have done that to you in similar vein where, you respect and admire them, but then either through their book or in some other ways, something has come up when we were just like, oh man, like it's they're not the same person to me anymore.
I can't think of one off the top of my head, but where it goes the other way for me is when I'm checking out, and I know we're talking about books, but when I'm checking out music documentaries. Like I mentioned Taylor Swift, and I checked out, I watched a documentary by her about her on Netflix, and so I learned about her because I didn't know anything about her, and so I gained a new respect for her as a business person and as a woman. Lady Gaga is another one. Didn't know anything about her, and then watched a music documentary about her. I'm like, oh my gosh, like I had no idea, this artist, this physical artist in New York City growing up, and then these outrageous kind of stage costumes that she would come up with. So those have been two examples where I'm like, I want to learn more about these people. Not necessarily going to spend the money on the book, but I'm paying for Netflix anyway, so let's check out the documentary, and then having mad respect for them after learning about them.
True. I mean, I recently read Ross Weston's memoir, A Little Bit Broken.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Host of Entertainment Tonight and Roz and Mocha, which is like my favorite podcast on Kiss 92.5. But, he came out with a memoir where it absolutely opens up, like to the point where he's like, not anybody knows these sides of me until this kind of memoir was written. And he goes through like parts of his persona that he's lied about just in public to people. Really? Yeah. All kinds of ways that we've known him. He has hidden his disability, which is Tourette's syndrome, for pretty much his entire life, to the point where people have no clue, like not even the closest people to him. Like people may have had some inklings, right? But no one's ever asked, and he's definitely put up walls against, making people comfortable to ask. And he comes out with, he just pours everything out. And a part of me was just like, whoa, this is, overwhelming compared to the person who he presents himself to be very deliberately in public. And so, some of the stories he's told, some of the things that he has led people to believe that are just, he said, absolute lies. He's just made them up.
Wow.
Completely.
So how did you feel about him by the end? Did you have respect about him opening up and talking about that? Because, Tourette's or mental health, whatever it is important.
Definitely respect, definitely a lot of compassion and empathy on just a human level. Mm-hmm. But I think for a lot of people in his life, perhaps, like people who he's hurt in the past, if they were to read this book, they'd be like, what the hell, man? Because it was brutal. Like, I'm not just talking little white lies here and there or things that you do because you're out in the public, right? And you want to have some privacy. I'm talking about, like, he has created entire percentages of himself, identity for the public. Yeah. It was a great book, by the way, but also respect because it was so well written.
What's the name of the book, Rams?
It's called A Little Bit Broken. And it's by Ross Weston.
Those
and he
types
narrates
of
the
book-
audiobook, and he's
Oh,
obviously
he
killer at
does.
it.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah.
Those types of books are very few and far between, where the author is like truly honest to God, like telling you the
Brutal.
truth. There is a lot of personal propaganda in biographies.
Yeah.
Something that I struggle a lot with autobiographies, especially, is that they'll often do things in chronological order. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and that happened, without having a consistent theme throughout. And Greg, I know you're a huge fan of Stephen King, but one of the things he said in his book on writing is that you should be writing for themes. If you have a book, be that nonfiction or fiction, you should always have a theme in mind that guides your book.
Yeah.
Biographies, autobiographies, and memoirs often do not have a theme. And Rams, this book that you're talking about, it sounds like it does have a theme.
It does have a theme. It is very intentional, and I totally agree with you, Jacob. I think that sometimes people, and oftentimes, people write thinking, I'm sharing my life story. That's the theme. Like, it's me. But it can't be, because I've read some god-awful memoirs where I'm just like, yeah, man, but somebody else has written this better than you. Right? Like, what is
It's
it
so
called?
true.
Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing, the Matthew Perry memoir. I mean, he's huge. He plays Chandler in Friends. Like, that's the theme. Like, he could just be like, of course you're going to read my memoir, but that's not it at all. The reason why it's gorgeous, like one of the best memoirs I've ever written, is because it pulls you back to a particular theme around feeling lonely even though you're huge. I guess that's kind of my way of summarizing the theme.
Yeah.
But he does that no matter what story he tells, no matter what age it is that he's describing to you, where in life, it brings you back to that. And again, two memoirs that I recommend, Greg, if you haven't read them yet.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned both of them, because Ross Weston is kind of a rock star with regard to just interviewing everybody in the industry in Canada, and of course his radio show. And Matthew Perry, I totally forgot about his audiobook, about his book that I want to read. And you mentioned Stephen King, and I want to thank you. You spoke a few weeks ago about Stephen King's new book that's coming out this year. I didn't even know there was a new book coming out this year. Oh. It's the third one in the Holly Gibney series, which I think one of you said you thought it was. And it was pre-ordered, given to me. It's been pre-ordered for me for Christmas. So thanks for bringing it up, because I didn't even know about it until you mentioned it here.
Quick things, Greg. What's your favorite Stephen King book?
It.
So good.
I would say totally agree. And then my backup would be The Stand. And then if you twisted my arm and asked me to say a third one, I would say Salem's Lot. I know you asked for one and I gave you three.
Least favorite Stephen King book? You have one?
The Tommyknockers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I wanted to ask, because I know you're a mega fan. We will do a deep dive into Stephen King, because I think he's well worth it. There's no superstar author like Stephen King. There's nobody on his level, and it feels like there's never going to be one ever again. He just came up in a time that allowed that. Social media makes it so that everybody's famous at the same time. Greg, this was awesome. We're going to make sure to include all of your recommendations in the description for everyone to check out. Thank you so much for bringing them forward. We'll bring you on again sometime soon. This was awesome.
Thanks.
That was Greg David, AMI's communications specialist, and Ramya Amathan. Thank you both so much. That's all the time we have for today's AMI audiobook review. This show airs on AMI Audio on weekends at 1 p.m. Eastern and repeats every 6 hours. It's also available on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts. Just look up AMI Audiobook Review. Leave us some feedback or any comments that you might have at our email, audiobookreview@ami.ca. We'd love to hear your feedback. I'm Jacob Szymanski. Have a good one.